Hello and welcome to Meeting People with me, Amal Pandey. Meeting People is a podcast where I have long conversations with adventurous, rebellious, and sometimes courteous free spirits. Today I'm thrilled to have an old friend called Chris Snowdon, who is head of lifestyle economics at the Institute of Economic Affairs. So, hi Chris. Nice to have you on. Thanks for sparing the time.
Nice to have you in the IA again.
Yeah. Quick question. What the hell is lifestyle economics?
Well, I am the inventor and foremost practitioner.
Category creator.
Of lifestyle economics. Yeah. Lifestyle economics, it's just a way of trying to pull in the issues I'm interested in, which are mainly what you might call nanny state issues.
Right.
But looking at them through the lens of economics, welfare economics in particular, but conventional, nickel and dime economics as well. And we sort of invented the title basically when I came here at the IA over a decade ago. And the idea was, let's, rather than just comment on these stories, ad hoc, let's really look at them systematically.
Yeah.
Gambling, smoking, vaping, alcohol, sugary drinks, fatty foods, all this kind of stuff. It's always in the news. There's always proposals to ban or restrict them in some way. And so let's, try and work out, rationally, using economic thinking, what is the best approach to these things? Because we're not saying it should be a free-for-all. We're not saying, do what you want. There should be some regulation, clearly. The fact that a lot of these products are restricted to adults shows that, regulation is perfectly appropriate. But what's the right level of it? Clearly, prohibition is going to be too far, for me at least. But total laissez-faire is too little. So, there are actually perfectly sensible, normal economic frameworks by which you can look at these issues. And essentially, it boils down to, where's the market failure here? If there's a problem with this product, what's the market failure? What are people not understanding about this product, right? If they're over consuming it, which is what the public health people think, firstly, can you prove that they're actually over consuming it, or are they just doing too much of something that you don't approve of, which is very different? That's not a market failure, that's just a difference of opinion. But it might be that people genuinely don't know that eating too many cream cakes is bad for their health, in which case maybe the government should tell them. Now, as it happens, people actually do know that eating too many cream cakes is bad for the health, so there isn't really a market failure there. Or there could be negative externalities. It could be that
on the health.
The most
pensions and like that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. The most common claim is, and you had it recently with the Tony Blair Institute for Global Governance, whatever it's called, said that obesity is now costing wider society £100 billion a year. Well, if it's costing the taxpayer £100 billion a year, maybe we should be taxing cream cakes, right? But in actual fact, you look at these figures, wider society does not mean what people maybe think it means at all.
Well, I want to come on to that, the kind of use of data, statistics, figures as something to kind of justify, pre-held, opinions. But before we do that, can you just give us a potted history of lifestyle interventions by the state? And the reason I ask is I think most people listening, or most people out there, have in their minds kind of a beginning and an end. So that we've kind of read about Cromwell banning Christmas and theatre in the interregnum, and we've watched a few Al Capone films, and we know about prohibition in the 1920s. But what are the key things that people should know in history in terms of policy about lifestyle economics, just so that they're better armed and equipped as to why we are where we are today?
It's a big question. I guess my answer would be that there are always people who are morally repulsed by certain behaviours, most of which you can find in the Bible, most of which have been banned in some places at some point in history. Gambling was basically banned in Britain until 1960. Apart from a bit of on-course bookmaking, there weren't casinos, wasn't a lottery until the 90s. So gambling has often been banned, sometimes for religious reasons, sometimes not. Alcohol obviously has been banned. You just mentioned prohibition in the 1920s. Lots of Islamic countries still ban it today. Smoking, my first book was about the history of anti-smoking. It's been banned plenty of times, not in this country, although
We're getting there.
maybe soon,
Yeah.
Food's never been really restricted. I mean, the worries about people getting too fat is a new thing, except I suppose going back to the Bible, you could say that, you know, greed and sloth and so on, the deadly sins. So maybe obesity hasn't been seen as a big problem before because there hasn't been much of it, or the only people who were obese were rich and they were making the rules. You know?
Yeah. So has there been, I mean, the other thing I remember, you know, reading about is the desire to kind of other lifestyles, intervention of other lifestyles like literature and culture and music. So Lady Chatterley's Lover, or, you know, in communist Russia, jazz was you know, banned. There seems to be, whereas if we look at it today, actually, there's not much appetite, really. I know there's some talk about rewriting Roald Dahl and that kind of thing, but there's not much appetite to ban culture, lifestyles. But there is increasing appetite to kind of intervene on kind of things that are unhealthy.
Yeah.
Are we actually in an illiberal age, or is this actually a bit of a golden age if you look at the history? Because there's always this push-pull tension between people who want to control and people who want to kind of live and let live. And this is just another period like any others, but actually it's not too bad.
No, I think we maybe have lived through as much of a golden age as we're going to.
Okay.
And it didn't last very long. I would say maybe the 90s and most of the noughties, perhaps. You could argue 60s, 70s, 80s in there as well to some extent. In terms of what I'm talking about, the nanny state stuff, arguably things are reasonably good between, let's say, the 60s and 2007 when the smoking ban came in, which I thought was a totemic moment, really. Since then, it's been open season and all sorts of activities. So no, I don't think we're living in a particularly liberal society, and I think it's getting worse quite rapidly. And I also see this whole nanny state agenda as being part of the sort of counter-enlightenment, you know, that we're living through, and the sort of cultural revolution, the iconoclasm, you know, tearing down statues, rewriting books. You know, this is going on. I used to think that public health academics were particularly kind of, you know, corrupt, really, or you know, particularly fanatical or ideological. But actually, you look at all sorts of academics now. Thanks to Twitter in particular, we can see what a lot of these people are thinking, and the weird censoriousness on campus. I think it's all part of a parcel of a sort of post-truth, deeply ideological, kind of narcissistic and very authoritarian view of the world.
Yeah.
Verging on totalitarian in many respects, in a micromanagement of people's lifestyles.
Well, can I pick you up on something you said earlier? Because you said there's a bit of a religious origin to some of the things that are frowned upon. And you could also make a counter argument that, you know, the Bible endorses a good, you know, hearty Christmas and a good hearty Sunday lunch, and all, there's plenty of things. Do your work, enjoy your life, and
yeah,
I feel like since the end of religion, as kind of Nietzsche predicted, that we have, you know, science has taken over religion in terms as the new religion in many ways, and we no longer render unto God what is God's, and render unto Caesar what is Caesar's. There is no more God. So everything, all the rendering is done by Caesar. Mm-hmm. So the state is actually the one that's in charge of your moral compass.
Yeah.
So you take a country like Portugal, for example, which is like a great example, I think, of just letting people get on with their lives. And there's a deeply Christian kind of culture in Portugal, which means that, you know, life is okay. People get on. Whereas in more atheistic societies,
and more Protestant societies,
that actually it's the death of religion that is causing a lot of this, because people are finding a new home for their religious beliefs, to kind of to whether it's climate change or it's, you know, how much exercise you should be doing, how much you should be eating. So do you think the lack of religion is to cause to some extent?
I think it's an interesting point. It is an interesting point that people need a moral code, and without religion, they have to start getting the state involved. I think there is actually a lot of truth in that. But also, you have to remember that, you know, when we say that traditionally the war on gambling, on alcohol, what have you, was being led by religions. It's just because the war and everything was led by religions, right? Historically, human beings have lived in very religious societies.
Yeah.
And so that inner, whatever this illiberal drive that people have is, whatever this urge to impose your lifestyle on other people, whatever that is, that became manifest through religion. Okay. Right. Now, so I think there's a risk of putting the cart before the horse, to saying, well, it's just religious people were like that. No, I think religions were like that because people are like that. And now the state is like that because people are like that. You know, that the drive hasn't gone away. Yeah. It's a bit like when people are accused of being Marxist because they have, you know, in my opinion, quite foolish ideas about how, you know, society should be operated. Most of them never read Marx. They've just fallen into the same intellectual trap that Marx did. Right? These you know, fallacies and mistakes have been in human beings for a very, very long time, and they manifest in different ways. So
there is an inherent...
Some people it was actual Marxism, and with some people, you know, if they're against booze or gambling, they would have been Methodists, or they would have been Muslims, or they are Muslims now. But getting rid of the religions doesn't get rid of that urge. I don't understand what the urge is, because I obviously don't. You know, I really don't feel that way about. I don't want to impose my lifestyle on other people. I do obviously think my lifestyle is better. I think my choices are better because it's subjective, and I wouldn't make the choices if I didn't think they were better. But I don't want to impose them on people. I don't care what people do. But some people do care very deeply what other people do.
Yeah, it's when you socialize things like health. I think when people aren't responsible for the outcomes of their lifestyle choices. Mm-hmm. Let's say so. If I live unhealthily, that means I'm going to have to spend more on my healthcare at some point in my life, and therefore I better take more responsibility. Well, actually, that responsibility has been taken away from me, and it's been collectivized.
Yeah,
and so therefore the responsibility falls on the government or society to make me act more healthily for the sake of the collective.
The socialized medicine creates moral hazard, basically, is what you're saying.
Correct.
Right?
Yeah.
Again, people say this, and I think there might be a bit of truth in it, but I'm not sure there's any evidence for it. I'm not sure there's any evidence that people were living healthier lives and taking better care of themselves before we had socialized medicine. I don't see any evidence that people in America, you know, watch their weight because they haven't got health insurance, right?
Yeah.
I think possibly because people have to pay for health insurance in America, they have got a lower smoking rate, actually, because I think you pay a bigger premium for being a smoker. I think that's one reason America's got such a low smoking rate despite having very little anti-smoking legislation. But maybe that's by the by. Again, I think it's a bit of an excuse. You know, people will constantly say we need to clamp down on all these things I don't like because it's costing the NHS money. Yeah. Why should I have to pay for them? I don't care if you want to smoke yourself to death, but I wouldn't have to pick up the pieces. People say this all the time. But I don't believe they're sincere. I think they're just trying to find an acceptable justification for what is actually in a liberal society quite an unacceptable thing to say, which is, I know better than you, and you're going to do this for your own good.
Yeah.
Okay. And I have explained hundreds of times to people over the years that actually smokers do not impose a net cost on society because, frankly, they tend to die younger, and therefore we save a lot of money on pensions and healthcare in old age and social care and so on. And loads of studies have shown this, and I haven't persuaded everybody of this, but I've persuaded a lot of people of it. They get it. When you think about it, it just kind of makes sense. But if they already believed in clamping down on smoking before, they don't change their mind because I've destroyed that argument. They just switch to another argument. You have to knock down a lot of arguments sometimes with people before they actually say what they really think, which is basically, I don't like smoking.
I don't like smoking.
Or I don't like fat people.
Well, can I actually, you mentioned two things in conjunction, and I actually would like to, what you say resonates, but I'd like to challenge it only from the perspective that I have a intuition that you can't genuinely know the impact of something like smoking on society. We just don't have the data set or the capabilities to analyze and crunch. And the reason is that smoking brings with it other lifestyle choices. I know plenty of fit, active people who smoke. And they're not going to die young. I mean, yes, there's a Russian roulette argument, but like the reality is that, like with any study, whether it's nutrition, whether it's exercise, most serious scientists will argue that actually, because we can't control for it, right? We can't just keep everyone's life exactly the same, but add the exercise in. Because when you start exercising, you start eating better and you start smoking less.
Yeah, and you have different personality types.
You've got different, and just everyone's bodies are different, right? So like everyone reacts to things differently. So are you playing by wrapping economics around lifestyle choices, almost falling into their trap by speaking on their turf or fighting on their terrain? Because you can't predict these things, and actually the live and let live thing is more powerful than the statistics thing. Does that make sense?
Well, I think they're fighting on my patch, because I work for an economic think tank and they're using economic arguments, and they don't know what they're talking about, basically. And as I say, lots of studies using all sorts of different methodologies have shown what I'm saying is correct, that smokers cost society, cost the government less than non-smokers do. And I think reasonably simple thought experiment shows it. It's not just smokers, by the way. The majority of preventive health measures end up costing more than they save, right? Because you need to look at what would happen if these people didn't do these risky things. There are one or two things like childhood vaccinations will save you money. Anything involving saving people from dying at a young age. You can stop young motorcyclists from dying. That will save you money. Reason being, you spend a lot of money putting people through school. You don't want them dying straight away. I'm talking here purely in economic terms, you understand. Whereas if someone dies on the day of their retirement of a heart attack instantly, that's the absolute result for the government. That's a perfect scenario. Every day beyond that point, they're going to be taking more out of the pot that they're putting in than they're putting in. So I think the economics on this is absolutely rock solid. And I wouldn't keep making the case were it not for people constantly saying the opposite. And then what happens is I say what I've just said to you, and they say, that's outrageous. You're encouraging people to die young to save the government money. Well, no, I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that this argument that is constantly used is not true. So pick a different argument.
Right. So you talked about Marx earlier, and, for what little Marx I have read, it's full of charts and data and
really, most of it's just kind of anecdote, really. Guesswork.
Well, him and his rich,
very, very bold assumptions.
His very rich manufacturing mate Engels used to kind of was Engels in Northern
Manchester, big fox hunter.
Big fox hunter, yeah.
Marx never stepped foot in a factory his entire life, I believe.
Right.
He was mainly in the British Library.
Okay. Well, I think this is one of my big bugbears, is kind of use of statistics in complex systems to kind of justify arguments. Like you mentioned something earlier, but there's plenty of studies that prove my point, and there's also plenty of studies. Just how do I be more skeptical when someone, like, what I read something recently, what was it? 38% of children in year 6 in England are obese, apparently. Now, who's gathered that data? How have they done it? Why is it robust? Is it true?
You got me on one of my pet subjects there. I think I'll resist the temptation for spending 10 minutes explaining it to you, and just point to, if anybody's interested, type in Snowdon critic childhood obesity. You'll find my article in the Critic explaining this. It's one of the most ludicrous statistics going there, the idea that 4 out of 10 11-year-olds are overweight. I've got a 12-year-old daughter, and I'm familiar with children of that age group and picking them up from school and so on, seeing them play football, and it's just nowhere near true, right? And you go, well, that's anecdotal evidence. Well, it's kind of, it's still evidence, right? If you're going around and supposedly nearly half of kids are overweight, and quite clearly only about 2 or 3% of them are, and it might be a little bit different in different parts of the country, I accept that, but I don't live in a particularly rich area, it's just not true. And as I say, I've looked into why it's not true, and it's pretty insane actually when you find out how they created this threshold of childhood obesity and childhood overweight. But no, it is absolutely not true. So your broader question: how do you decide? How does any layman decide or work out or judge whether the evidence they're being given is correct or not? Well, they can't really, without spending a huge amount of time. You can follow my Twitter feed. I kind of do it for a full-time job, writing about
at CJ Snowdon, by the way,
these terrible claims that are made all the time. I find it quite interesting. Most people don't. So no, I mean, basically people will trust authority, generally speaking, and you should be able to trust authority. And it's a real shame that you can't, but it's not just public health. It's, a lot of academia has just gone down in this horrible wormhole whereby they say what they want to be true, what is true.
Well, we saw that in COVID, and we see that with economics. I mean, economics is the ultimate tool of like oppression or ex post justification for policies that have no kind of rational.
Well, forecasting is garbage, isn't it?
Yeah.
Right? In most areas, unless you've got something that's very straightforward, forecasting is terrible. And if you've got people who've got a certain agenda, then we give forecasters far too much power. I think that the COVID scenarios, forecasts, not predictions, but forecasts. Apparently, there's a difference in a forecast and a prediction. My dictionary says they're basically the same thing, but according to COVID modelers, these are only forecasts and not predictions. But they obviously were predictions. They were predictions of what would happen under certain scenarios. And you get to July 2021 when Boris Johnson wants to have Freedom Day, and the forecast said if you go ahead with Freedom Day, you are going to have a massive number of people dying from COVID, and it's going to spiral very, very rapidly. And it didn't. It came down. It came down within days of the final of Euro 2021 or Euro 2020, whatever we're supposed to call it, which any common sense armchair epidemiologist could have forecast, because that's when everybody was socializing, right? And then you get to Omicron 6 months later, and all the models are going, "Oh, this is dreadful. We basically need to lock down again." They were wrong, and they were all wrong in the same wrong direction of being way too pessimistic. And I can't, looking at the sort of maths of it, I can't work out how every single, even their most optimistic projection was wrong. Other than that, the modelers just were pessimistic, and they were trying to bounce Boris Johnson into lockdown. In my opinion, economic forecasting is garbage as well. You've got who can possibly tell what GDP is going to be like in 2027? There's just no way of possibly knowing that, and yet the OBR and the Bank of England will come out with these figures, and they'll be treated with respect, if not as gospel, despite the fact that every single one of these projections has been wildly off. All the projections of what would happen. Brexit has been off. So, I don't think they need to make these projections at all. If they do, they should just be an academic exercise where a handful of people at Bank of England should look at them. They shouldn't be beamed across the BBC going, "Oh my God, look at what's happening. We're going to be the worst in the G." How many times is Britain going to be the worst in the G20 or the G7? And when it comes down to it, we're usually actually pretty average.
Yeah. Good old average Britain. Well, what I love about, had the oil price not done that, I would have been right in my forecast. Or had there not been a recession in China, I would have been right in my forecast. So hang on, mate. Like that, isn't your model meant to supposedly?
Well, there are some exogenous factors, I guess you could say, like the war in Ukraine, where we didn't know that was going to happen, so that messes up the forecast. Fair dues. But a lot of the time, nothing very much happens, and the forecast should be roughly accurate, and it's not. And it's not their fault. Nobody could forecast it properly. It's a complete guessing game, really. I think with Brexit, again, you had this inbuilt pessimism of, well, clearly this is going to be disastrous. So all the models, again, were more pessimistic than they should have been. But it all comes down to people's assumptions. Right? If you assume that Brexit is going to be an absolute fiasco, then that's what your model is going to show. And they do a lot of modelling in public health and, minimum unit pricing for alcohol. The evidence for that was almost exclusively modelling from one group of modellers in Sheffield. And by and large, it was very, very wrong. And the policy had never been tried before, so fair enough. Put it through a model. But it was treated by the Scottish government as being absolutely, to the nearest decimal point, this is what's going to happen. There will be 62 fewer deaths. Ludicrous level of sort of certainty and accuracy about this stuff. The sugar tax also had a model, turned out to be completely wrong. They're only as good as the assumptions go into it. And if the models are being created by people who are advocating for the policy, they're advocating it because they think it's going to work. So their model is going to show it's going to work. It could not do otherwise, could it?
It shows the biases of the person writing.
That's all it shows. Yeah. You might as well just do something on the back of an envelope. Do you agree with policy? Yeah. Do you think it's going to work? Yeah. Okay, there's our evidence. Make an impact assessment based on that.
Okay, so stop me throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Is statistics, can it be a useful tool? When can it be useful? when should we listen? Because I'll give you an example. I'm trying to be as open-minded as possible about the efficacy of mask mandates, let's say. Now, I'm not saying whether they should be mandated, but do they work or not? Forget it. And I see the people who believe in mask mandates giving me lots of studies. So, and then people who don't say, "Oh, there's this Danish study that says this." And I'm like, but what the hell? What am I? Does it? Whether we should do it or not is another question. Versus, does it actually work? And intuitively, wearing a mask does work to help, stop you helping someone else. That's why Asian countries do it. Before COVID, it was like a thing. If you have a cold, you wear it to go on public transport as a kind of etiquette thing to stop you passing on your thing to other people. But there's plenty of just this deafening, like, just constant war of statistics that just means that we can't see the wood from the trees, and we can't get back to core principles. Is that, like, should I be doing, even if this is the case, is it worth it?
Yeah. I mean, I can't answer the question of whether mask mandates work because I genuinely don't know. I agree with you that masks must work in some context, which is why surgeons wear them and so on, right? That doesn't definitely mean it. I mean, it's possible for people to do something completely pointless for a sustained period of time, but the fact that they do it and the basic physics of the thing, that some germs and viruses will get caught in the mask, presumably, leads you to think that it must have some sort of benefit. The question for me with that would be, as you kind of allude to, is the benefit big enough to force people to do something for months and months on end, or years on end in the case of poor medics? And I think you can say fairly clearly, no, it's not worth it. In the course of the pandemic, there were two things that very clearly worked, and you could see it, going back to statistics, by just looking at what happened, over the previous year or whatever it was. Lockdowns, whatever a handful of people may say, lockdowns clearly led to a reduction in infections. You could see it every time we had a lockdown, and in other countries too, so long as the lockdowns were followed reasonably closely, they weren't completely flouted. It's really quite obvious just looking at a graph of infections, hospitalizations, or deaths with a certain lag. After the lockdown began, rate would decline. Okay, that worked, and the vaccinations worked. Again, you can look at the graphs, you can see how many people were infected, you can see how many people died. Once people were vaccinated, the number of people who got infected continued to be very, very high, with the various variants that were knocking around, but the number of people who died was very low, and it continues to be really low now, incredibly low. They definitely worse. Mask mandates, I think the mask mandate came in July 2020, I think. Yeah. All of a sudden, having, of course, told government proves they do not work at all. Don't waste, don't waste your time and money. Public Health England advised the Advertising Standards Authority to ban an advert for face masks in the early days of the pandemic, because they said it was not just like misleading to say that this might protect you from COVID, but actually outrageous. Kind of, this is exploitation of public fears to tell people that face masks might help in any way with COVID-19. Just what a bunch of charlatans this company were. So the face mask mandate comes in July 2020. It's not obvious at all to me that it made any difference, right? Infections started rising. People were wearing them all over the place. I think the Plan B thing was basically just wearing face masks. Remember Plan B? Yeah. It didn't have any marked effect, put it that way. Not to say that cases wouldn't have been a little bit higher had nobody been wearing a face mask. Quite possibly that is true. But it just didn't seem to me a big enough effect to require everybody to be doing it. I thought it was theatrical, really.
Yeah. And it had some, and this is the challenge with modelling, it had some negative impacts. If you're a school teacher trying to, or a
lip reader.
Yeah, a lip reader. Yeah,
very good for
their livelihoods were certainly impacted, I can imagine.
Well, deaf people, I mean.
Yeah. But like, even for example, how do you include in your model about the positive benefits of lockdown, the impact on schooling or lack thereof, or a single mum in a cancelled tower block with 3 kids and stuff. And
human well-being is not counted in this. And this is actually one of the big problems with the public health movement as it stands. Not just with COVID, which is an extreme kind of example of it, but with all of it. They will go, this is, we've got a model here and it's going to save 62 people's lives. Okay, right. Well, what's the trade-off there? What's the knock-on effect, right? You're raising the price of alcohol. So that's going to cost drinkers quite a bit of money. That's not good. That's a literal cost of this policy. If this policy is going to cost tens of millions of pounds and hit the poorest hardest, is it really worth it to maybe save 62 people from drinking themselves to death? But people didn't want to have that conversation. They don't want to have that conversation with anything, about anything. They certainly didn't want to have it with COVID. In the relatively early days of the pandemic, around about May 2020, Toby Young wrote this article. I don't know if you remember. He wrote an article for Unheard or somebody saying we need to do a cost-benefit analysis with this. We've been in lockdown for 2 months. Kids aren't going to school. Lots of people are lonely. People aren't really going to hospital to get things treated or diagnosed. And, generally speaking, the Department of Health puts the value of a quality-adjusted life year at about £60,000 a year. So let's accept we're saving this many lives, and that's worth this much in kind of monetary terms. What's the rest of it costing? What's the monetary cost of the things we're sacrificing? And of course, a lot of it, there's no government department has any kind of financial estimate for
unintended consequences.
An hour of enjoying yourself, an enjoyable, weekend with your family, seeing your friends, the things that actually make life worth living and are not monetized. And that's exactly the same with the boozing and the smoking and the gambling and so on. You can fully accept that these things have health effects. Of course they do. But people do them for a reason, which is that they really quite enjoy them. And they wouldn't like to live without them. And that would be a big cost on them. I would love to force them to live without them.
I'd love to do some sort of study. I mean, it's just not possible. That's the thing. But the net positive benefits of alcohol over time in terms of the relationships, that you fast track bonding in a way that you just don't when you're sober.
Yes.
Which is immeasurable. So, but the benefits could be huge for.
Well, I think there are real financial benefits there because drinkers get paid more than non-drinkers. Now, of course, you mentioned confounding factors. There could be all sorts of reasons for that, but one of them could well be that they're down the pub, socialising with their colleagues, networking, that kind of thing. We have in economics we have the concept of consumer surplus, which is the monetization of the amount of enjoyment, utility you get from doing something. But that too is quite difficult to measure. Other than that, we assume that it is more than the amount spent on the product. Okay, so if people are spending £30 billion a year on booze in this country, we assume that is creating at least £30 billion of enjoyment that the temperance movement would simply deny exists.
Yeah. Well, value is in the mind, which is that kind of Austrian.
Indeed. And that is why you're best off leaving people alone, because only they can put the valuation on whatever it is they're buying, and different people will value it very differently. Around about half the population wouldn't smoke even if cigarettes were harmless, because about half the population doesn't get any enjoyment from nicotine. We kind of know that from just looking at the 1940s, when everyone thought smoking was harmless or
healthy,
or even healthy. Yeah. And about half the population didn't smoke. Some people tried smoking. Agatha Christie tried many times, she said, to smoke. She really wanted to, but she just couldn't get on with it. She didn't like it at all.
Yeah. She liked the idea of it. It's a bit like me. I think I like the idea of it.
So when you get to the 50s and all the lung cancer studies start coming out, there's quite a few people relieved because they could finally give up. They didn't want to smoke in the first place. They were the first people to quit.
Yeah. Well, I went to I listened to, I don't know how closely you've been following the ESG movement in investing.
A little bit, yeah.
I mean, it's the thesis.
I buy all the ones that are boycotted by the ESGs. Yeah, they do pretty well as well.
Yeah. Well, funny enough, defense stocks all of a sudden matter when you're trying to when you're spending.
I couldn't buy them when the Ukraine war started. I tried to buy some on my app. I think my app is too woke to sell BAE or whatever.
Well, they did. The shares did very well, unfortunately.
I'm sure they did. Yeah.
Because people woke up.
Well, I've got oil and I've got I sold some now. I've got oil and sold my tobacco now, but booze is still quite strong.
On the tobacco, I mean, I listened to a talk by a well-regarded investment firm who argued the whole point about ESG is kind of investing in companies that improve society beyond corporate profitability. So there's a broader responsibility to stakeholders, and actually the best investment to make from an ESG lens is tobacco companies, because they're disrupting their own business models through effectively cannibalizing their cash flow generative cigarette sticks by investing in vaping.
Yeah.
Now, people listen to this aren't on top of the kind of nuances of regulations pro against vaping. There was a documentary on Netflix which has created a lot of opinion.
Oh, the Juul one.
The Juul, about the
Yeah,
fact
it's really
that
good
this-
actually.
Okay.
A lot better than I thought it'd be.
Well,
What was it called? The big.
I can't.
The big vape.
The big vape. I think that's it. So it's worth watching. Would you
It
say?
is. Oh, yeah, very good. I mean, I assumed it would be anti-vaping propaganda, like most of the stuff that comes out of America to do with e-cigarettes is, but actually it was pretty balanced.
So what do you say to kind of a dilettante kind of, non-industry specialist or lifestyle economist that, vaping is actually a hugely positive thing? If they go, well, it looks like they're targeted to children. I see lots of school kids doing it. I don't quite like it. Something about it doesn't feel like right. What's the base case that vaping is actually a huge, what feels to me like a huge positive that I can't articulate?
It's incredible innovation, and it really depresses me to see so many people, particularly in public health, opposing something that is way more effective than they've ever been in stopping people smoking.
Yeah.
And yeah, I had no intention of giving up smoking. I was a very prolific and committed smoker. I'd basically made my mind up I was going to take my chances with this because I liked it so much that if it was a 50-50 chance of getting a smoking-related disease, I'd just hope for the best. And then I started dabbling with vaping, and once I found reasonable quality e-cigarette and a flavour I got on with, that was it. I never looked back.
So you don't smoke now at all?
No, I got 200 cigarettes in my drawer at home, which I bought over a year ago in America because they were so cheap I couldn't resist buying them. And they had proper cigarettes in America as well, not this EU-regulated rubbish. It limits the tar and the nicotine content. And I haven't smoked any.
Hang on,
they're still there in my drawer.
So cigarettes
that
we buy here, sorry, just to clarify,
they're all basically ultra lights now.
They're all ultra lights.
By the standards of the 60s, they are literally all ultra lights.
Okay, right. But so you've got stuff that gives you the hit that you used to enjoy, but you don't like it or you don't do it. You don't feel the need to do it.
I'm quite happy. I mean, it's such a close substitute, as far as I'm concerned, that I feel no compulsion whatsoever to light a cigarette. And now, not everyone's like that, and I'm not going to say we should force everyone to start vaping, of course. But for me, it's bang on, and you'd think anti-smoking people would be happy with that, right? That somebody who's so committed to smoking, he was no intention of giving up, and more or less devoted his career to defending smokers. Even he gave up thanks to vaping. Yeah, maybe this has some potential, right? And it clearly has potential because millions of people have given up thanks to vaping. So there's straight away you've got the paternalistic health argument, right? You should like vaping. The libertarian argument is obviously people should do whatever they want, but this is pretty cool because it should give you more consumer well-being, right? It should give you more consumer surplus because it was cheaper, does the same kind of thing, and it hasn't got any major health consequences. Yeah. So straight away, that trade-off is much more favorable to using nicotine, right? You enjoy using nicotine, cool. Now you can use it without the health consequences. The health consequences were a major part of the cost of smoking, effectively, in addition to the very high cost from the high rates of taxation. And therefore, we shouldn't be surprised if people are taking up vaping. That's the thing. We shouldn't be very surprised if the cost of it has effectively dropped, both financially and in terms of health. And the benefits of it, in terms of just enjoying some nicotine, have remained more or less the same. So any economist would expect you to see higher take-up of vaping. It goes back to what I was saying just a minute ago. Around about 50% of the population do have get benefits from using nicotine. They really enjoy it. The other half don't like it. And apparently we're now just living in a world in which the two halves are fighting each other, and one half is losing badly, partly because that half drops, in fact, in practice to about 13%. So it's a tremendous free market solution to a public health problem, and still people object to it, and they always have done long before there was even any concern about youth vaping. People objected to it immediately because they just thought it's a bit too much like smoking, and the tobacco industry started selling these things. Now we want to destroy the tobacco industry, so we can't allow them to move to selling something cheaper, something less harmful. So that was just, I think, largely just good old-fashioned Puritanism, the objection to vaping. Now, today there is more of a legitimate concern about kids vaping, and it is not a good thing. I absolutely agree. I just don't think kids should be using any form of drug, basically, and nicotine's a drug. And it is shocking how young some of the people are who are vaping. I'm well aware of that. But we do have laws on the books to stop this. It has been illegal to sell a vape to an 18-year-old for a long time.
So it just needs enforcement of existing laws.
We managed to enforce the laws on tobacco pretty well. It's really very difficult for a kid to get hold of cigarettes legally, well, not legally, but from a shop. And the same is true of vodka. I'm not saying no kids ever do it, but generally they'll be 16 or 17 wearing a false moustache or whatever, and you go to a fairly shady retailer to begin with. You're not going to walk into Tesco and buy some vodka and fags, right? Whereas it seems to me that you've got kids as young as 10 or 11 going into corner shops, buying unregulated vapes. So the vapes themselves are illegal a lot of the time and more dangerous as a consequence very often. And that doesn't seem to be, trading standards don't seem to be doing anything about that. So it would be nice for once if the government tries to enforce the laws it already has before it starts making new ones.
It feels like a fairly simple policing.
Just go do spot checks. Send some kids in there as bait, and see which ones. And then give them a 10 grand fine.
Yeah, no, enough of that. And that'll stop happening.
Well, we've done it. Like I say, we've done it with cigarettes.
Yeah. So we are not, in your mind, then becoming a. Let me ask it another way. There's this, historians of empires will say that there's a kind of recurring theme of kind of clogs on the way up, silk slippers on the way down. And we're in this kind of end of empire status where we're all obese, unhealthy, sort of, and we're kind of taking too much pleasure in too many effete.
Because like the fall of Rome.
Yeah, the fall but in your mind, we're not an obese, kind of unhealthy, kind of overly kind of drug dabbled, alcoholics culture. It's just statistics used by people with puritanical urges to control, using the certainty of future forecasting and modelling to kind of as their kind of chief weapon.
Well, by and large, that's right. I mean, most of it is just faked, right? H.R. Mencken said, so I'm paraphrase, but he said something like, the practical business of politics is creating an endless series of hobgoblins with which to terrify the public, thus leading them to come to the government demanding to be rescued. And the series of hobgoblins are all imaginary. Now, not all of the hobgoblins you mentioned are imaginary. It is true that rates of obesity amongst adults is at a relatively high level of something like 26%, and obesity is a proper health hazard. It is a genuinely it's a condition. I know some people go, oh, well, what about these rugby players? They're obese. Yeah, there's people on the margins, as with any category, but actually obesity is a pretty reasonable definition. Not for kids, as I say, but for adults it is. But the rest of it's all bullshit, really. The problem gambling rate is ridiculously low, 0.3, 0.4%, has been for 20 years. Smoking rate's gone down. It's halved in the space of 20 years. And drinking, people drink remarkably little. Not everybody, obviously, not me, but compared to...
So young people are drinking less.
Young people drink nothing, pretty much. I mean, they go out and have 1 pint of craft beer for £8, and that's a lot. Make it last all night, Yeah. So, yeah, unless the statistics are lying to us about this, but I don't see any reason why they would suddenly be wrong. People are, generally speaking, pretty moderate, and there are no epidemics of, drinking, smoking that's going to topple the NHS, as people claim. But in order to keep the panic going, these the goalposts have to be moved, for one thing. So they'll keep changing. They're trying to change the definition of problem gambling right now to make it look like there's like 8 times as many problem gamblers as there actually are. They switch to online. Basically, instead of doing a face-to-face interview, you go online, and when you go online, suddenly there's a huge selection bias because it turns out if you send someone an email saying, "Would you like to take a survey about gambling, people who are interested in gambling, which obviously includes problem gamblers, are more likely to say yes than people who are not interested in gambling.
Right.
So you just whack up the figures. It's a well-known flaw in the system, but the Gambling Commission's doing it anyway because it wants to exaggerate the number of problem gamblers so it can regulate gambling more. And you get this a lot in all sorts of areas. We had the drinking guidelines dropped a few years ago. It was the same people I mentioned from Sheffield University. They did some modelling on this. Their initial model actually backed up the existing guidelines at the time, which was 21 units for men. And Public Health England said, yeah, can you change this? You go, what do you mean? Well, can you change the model? Can you make this assumption, this assumption, this assumption? And they said, to be fair to them, and this is all on the record, there's emails exist, I've seen. They said, well, we wouldn't make that assumption because that's never going to happen. And he just, well, just do it. And they said, well, it's going to cost you $7,000. I said, fine. And they did it, and they changed the model, and suddenly the model now supports 14 units for men, which is what the government wanted to do, or what Public Health England wanted to do. So you get this goalpost shifting, which requires some extremely sharp practice, but it's all designed to make problems look like they're getting worse when they're not.
Well, it sounds like a phenomenal grift if that's the way our public servants are behaving. I mean, how much to double click on obesity again? How much of this is just an issue that the human race is grappling with in the new age of abundance? So, like now, it's just because food is plentiful.
That's exactly what it is, I think. Yeah,
we'll just adjust to that accordingly. We'll learn not to have so many donuts every day because we'll figure it out that actually.
I think that's already happening actually. And again, if you look at young people's diets, not across the board obviously, but they seem, generally speaking, much more conscious of what they're eating than I was at that age, or indeed still am. There's a theory I have, and I don't know if you could even gather evidence for it, but I have this theory very much in line with what you're saying, which is there's an intergenerational thing going on, because it's well known that people lower down the socioeconomic ladder are more likely to be obese than people who are rich. The difference is actually not quite as stark as sometimes is made out, but there's definitely a clear difference. And I wonder whether, because we've had a shift from sort of a manufacturing economy to a service economy, it's going to take a while for people whose forefathers were in heavy industry to adjust their diet accordingly. If you're in heavy industry, you can eat whatever you want, and the more the merrier, really. You're just going to burn it off. If you sat around doing telesales, you're not going to do that. But if you're still used to eating what your parents fed you, then there's going to be a bit of weight put on. But you would think after a while, people who are doing telesales or sat in offices will adjust to that. And maybe the government has some role in kind of educating people about these things. I don't know, but I do wonder, whether people can adjust. On the other hand, people are so physically inactive now, very often, that I think we've got to the point at which just the natural human appetite is going to bring in more calories than you're going to burn off. Do you know what I mean?
Right.
I mean, you can only starve yourself to a certain extent. If you literally don't do any exercise whatsoever, and you're not even sort of walking down the street, then I think it would require a lot of willpower to eat as few calories as you should be doing.
Yeah, I mean, I think I definitely agree that the younger generation are much more conscious of different diet.
Too conscious.
Do you reckon?
They're too conscious of all this. Yeah,
they're not having enough fun.
Hypochondriacs on antidepressants. Yeah. They should have a drink, I think.
So, are you familiar with Jonathan Haidt? Yeah. Okay. So, like,
his theory about the smartphones and things.
Yeah. What do you think about that? So, basically, it's
a good correlation. I wouldn't be surprised if there's some truth in it. It's almost too neat a correlation, don't you think? Like 2013 is exactly the point.
This is the year that. So basically, for people,
the world went crazy.
People watching or listening to Jonathan Haidt's a really respected psychologist who argues that the social media effectively particularly for young girls, and I can see this as a father of two little girls, that has created more anxiety amongst young people and more kind of self-conscious and more. They're not a bunch of snowflakes. They are genuinely triggered or disturbed by things that they don't understand or are not comfortable with or they don't like, in a way that older generations just aren't, because of the social media hacking of the brain.
Yeah,
using
but also that they're very narcissistic and thin-skinned.
Yes,
that comes into it too, right?
Yeah, because they are, their meaning has been wrapped around, has been gamified by things like likes or reposts.
Yes, exactly.
And so they basically need to lighten up and the future.
Well, just throw away, log off Instagram.
Yeah.
I saw a study very recently being tweeted, I think probably by Height actually, which showed that in America, the majority of these kids, teenagers, whatever, actually hate Instagram. And if everybody else got off it, they would love to get off it too. There's this horrendous networking effect, which makes them feel they have to go on it. But it's actually, they know it's making them miserable.
Yeah.
And they would like to delete the app, but they can't because everybody else is on it.
Well,
that's a pretty bad situation.
There's a US presidential candidate called, Vivek Ramaswamy, I don't know if you're following him, but he argues that, these things are as addictive, if not way more addictive than
cigarettes.
physical substances. Because they literally hack into your dopamine system in a way that other things don't. Mm-hmm. So if you think that alcohol or tobacco should be illegal until the age of 18 because your brain is not formed yet to make cognizant free choices, actually you should be banning social media for kids under 18. Is that the nanny state in action, or do you have some sympathy with that?
I have some sympathy with it, yeah. Well, I'm not against banning the sale of alcohol and cigarettes to kids. Let's remember, I do accept that's perfectly reasonable. Paternalism is fine with kids, right?
Literally, yeah.
It's just only becomes paternalism when you involve adults in it.
Yeah.
I won't let my daughter use TikTok, put it that way. And I wouldn't be I've said she can have it when she's 13, but I'm not very keen on having it when she's 13, to be quite honest. And I think TikTok is particularly pernicious because not to get too conspiracy minded about it. Like, I do think it is partly being used by the Chinese to destroy the West. I really find that quite a credible hypothesis. And even if it isn't, then I think that's going to be the effect. So whether it's deliberate or not, it's still a bad thing.
Well, I don't know if it's fake news, but you hear stories about, kids in China are being, every 10 TikToks are being told about maths or the
they get a totally different version of TikTok that you can't use after 10 p.m. Yeah, that's absolutely true.
It stops and it goes
Chinese TikTok algorithms are all, it all pushes up the stuff about eating vegetables and things. Yeah. Whereas ours just, I don't know, just absolutely mindless rubbish that is just continuous. So look, I agree. I think we are engaging in an experiment with young people. We have no idea what the consequences are going to be, and they might be okay. We might just raise a generation of kids who are actually very cynical about this kind of stuff and seen a huge amount of information and know how to filter out the good from the bad. Or it could be absolutely disastrous, and we raise a generation of narcissistic snowflake psychopaths or something, which is a weird combination.
We'll find out when they're
snowflake psychopath.
God, yeah. Well, I suppose when we're all old, and we'll see if they're looking after us or not, or how they're looking after us, we'll figure out whether that's.
They'll just like our tweets or something. Never see it.
Yeah, Chris, you tweeted something in 2024, and I think that's kind of triggering me somewhat. So no dinner for you tonight. Do you have a definition of populism?
No, not really. It's used about everybody these days, isn't it? And a lot of these people have absolutely nothing in common. It seems to be just anything that doesn't fit into a kind of neat sort of Blairite kind of ideal, doesn't it, really? Just people saying things that the, for want of a better term, metropolitan elite think are completely outside the boundaries of reasonable discussion, like leaving the European Union, for example, like leaving the European Convention on Human Rights. But also is quite ideologically confusing because it mixes left-wing ideas and right-wing ideas.
Yeah,
that seems to be. I think that's always been kind of part of populism. Is you can't define it as being left-wing or right-wing very easily, because they will tend to be in favour of a lot of state support for farmers or for various industries, but at the same time will be quite conservative in social issues.
It's a term that really frustrates me, but where it does have some resonance is that long-term worry I have about democracy, which is that ultimately everyone votes themselves all the money. and they'll vote for the party that gives them all the money from the people who are making it. And in the short term, it's a word that is anything I disagree with, right? A policy that's proposed that I don't like, that has public traction, or a party that's won an election that I don't like, and therefore, if my side wins, it's the democratic will of the people, of course. But if the other side wins, it's this horrible populist movement. But do you think there's something kind of fundamentally challenged with a post kind of welfare state democracy that will just lead to ever enlarging states that? Or is there a self-correcting mechanism that we get like every now and then, like in 1979?
Both, I think, is probably the case. I think eventually there has to be a self-correcting mechanism because the state runs out of money. And we're getting to that point now. Maybe this guy in Argentina who's also described as
A populist.
both a populist and on the far right, and the far right is another term that is used a bit too widely these days to describe all sorts of different people. Maybe eventually you hit a wall and you've got to do something quite radical to fix it. I think the self-correcting mechanism is just having politicians who are reasonably responsible people who think beyond their own careers and beyond the next 5 years. And I think we did used to have those people, genuinely. I don't think it's nostalgic to say that there were people in both the main parties who would not be completely reckless with the public finances. And when Tony Blair became Prime Minister, he was committed to conservative spending limits in the first term, not after that, but for the first term, and he stuck to them. And we ran a surplus for a few years, not very long, but we did it for a few years. And after that, it started going up, and it's gone up and up and up, and it's gone up way more under the Conservatives. And you can't see any democratic reason why it wouldn't keep going up to the absolute maximum until you get something like the mini budget, where people finally realise, oh, actually, you can't just completely, go crazy with the public finances and not even pretend you're going to pay some of this money back. You've at least got to get the OBR into pretend there's some sort of plan to bring in spending restraint at some point, which is what Jeremy Hunt's done, even though he's going to keep borrowing more and more money in actual fact, because he's going to lead the Labour Party to clear up the mess. And the democratic incentives are always to do that, actually. They're always to borrow as much money as possible and then leave the next lot to clear up the mess. And it's kind of amazing that the Conservatives in the 90s didn't do that. They actually reduced spending when they could have found all sorts of pet projects to spend the money on. And I guess the public quite liked that. Otherwise, Blair wouldn't have made this pledge to stick to the spending limits. Blair could have said, no, we're not going to stick to the spending limits. We're going to spend more money on the NHS. But he actually didn't do that. After 4 years he did. Gordon Brown turned on the spending tap. But look, I think there is a real problem with 4 or 5 year parliaments, in that people just want to get re-elected, and you get re-elected by spending more money on things.
It is the type of politician that predominates or dominates the challenge, because politics has become a career in a way that it wasn't. And is that part of the problem? That before, I know you're not nostalgic, but about this, and I think I agree with you on this. But before that, it wasn't something you entered into to kind of make lots of money and go off and kind of become a consultant at for the military industrial complex, whatever it might be. Whereas now it's become a career. Yeah,
I think that's part of the problem. But I think we have a very low grade of politician generally, but that's probably a reflection of the fact that we have a low-grade population. I mean, you watch Question Time, you get infuriated by what the people on the panel are saying, and then you go to the audience and you go, Christ, well, we get the politicians we deserve, because, I mean, the people in the audience are just absolute morons. And you go, okay, well, these are the people who are going to vote for the politicians, so the politicians have to say something stupid to appeal to the stupid people in the audience, And I actually don't have that low opinion of the British public in general. The people who go to Question Time audiences are just particularly bad, I think. But generally, I think maybe it's controversial to say, but I think the standards of intelligence and responsibility amongst the people in general seems to have declined over the years. You know, and a lot of politicians you can look back on in the 60s and 70s. You know, they'd served in the war and stuff like that. And they just seem much more grown up. Maybe it's because I'm getting older. I don't know. But I think genuinely you would say that someone like Harold Wilson or Winston Churchill or James Callaghan, you know, these people had a certain amount of gravitas. Dennis Healy, you know, didn't have to agree with them.
Yeah.
Margaret Thatcher, obviously, you know, they just seem to, I don't know, just be grown ups in a way that the current batch on both sides are not.
Is a source of optimism the reality that we're almost in a post-politics world where politicians can't really affect that much? You know, from a negative sense, the institutions have been taken over by this kind of Gramsci-esque, you know, movement, take over the academia, the media, the civil service. And that's just that's why successive conservative governments have struggled to really do anything.
Yeah, it's a blob theory, isn't it?
It's a blob theory. But actually, the people who are really changing the world are not politicians. It's the entrepreneurs, it's the Elons of this world that actually have, it's the entrepreneurs, the innovators that are going to make our lives better. And we need to, you know, if you listen to the Elons as well, they say, look, we're not having enough kids. We know the wrong, you know, we all need to have more kids because we need to have more ideas to solve these things versus the human race being a kind of cancer on the earth that needs to be.
Yeah, I'm not convinced that the world hasn't got enough people, to be honest with you. I'm not one of these people who thinks that what we need is another 8 billion people. I think 8 billion are probably sufficient to cope with the problems we've got in the world. And you're right about, you know, the entrepreneurs being the ones who make the world better. Unfortunately, the entrepreneurs don't have the power to decide whether we build nuclear power stations or reservoirs or houses and all the things that actually politicians can do. And I think this blob excuse, although I do accept that there's a huge amount of resistance to meaningful change amongst the civil service and academics and so-called experts, I think it is an excuse. I fully expect over the next few years to see various autobiographies of various Conservative Party figures, ministers, you know, ex-ministers, saying, I wanted to do all this stuff. I tried so hard to do it, but I couldn't get it past the civil service. I couldn't get it past such and such. Suella Braverman's a great example of that. You know, somebody who was literally the Home Secretary, had one of the most powerful people in the country. And while Home Secretary, just going on these sort of GB News style rants about why isn't the government doing this, why isn't the government doing that? Well, yeah, if only you were in a position of power to do something about it. And she would go, we can't do it because of this and that, and the lefty lawyers, blah, 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 blah. Well, look, yeah, there is resistance, sure. But if you literally can't do anything, we might as well give up. I mean, the Conservative Party might as well back up its tent and go home. I don't believe that's true. And one of the things I like about Dominic Cummings is he was prepared to take these forces on. And to some extent, he did beat them. Never clear to me what he actually wanted to do, having sorted things out, but he was prepared to try and sort things out. So you can't tell me that in nearly 14 years of Conservative government, the Conservatives couldn't have reshaped things around them in order to you know, do Conservative things. They could have done. They just haven't been looking at it strategically. They've been looking at it very short term. There's been 4 or 5 prime ministers. I can't even keep count anymore. They've not been thinking long term about, and this is the problem. This is what I mean about politics. They don't think long term.
Yeah.
It is absurd that we haven't built any nuclear power stations for
or any houses.
30 or 40 years, or not enough houses, certainly. We haven't built any reservoirs for something like 30 years. I mean, the reservoirs are really quite a simple thing to build. You find a field, dig a hole. You know, people aren't really going to object to it. They look quite nice. It's just a lake, basically. Right? Yeah. So they haven't taken on the various vested interests or the NIMBYs or the civil service, blah, 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 blah. And actually, I think the civil service get a lot of blame that should be apportioned to politicians. I think a lot of civil servants, not all of them, I'm sure there are some ideologues in there, but a lot of them just want straightforward instructions of this is what we're trying to do, this is how we want to go about it, rather than constantly shifting selection of low-grade ministers popping in and out the door with a completely different agenda.
Yeah, well, low-grade ministers, just to circle back to something you said earlier about the kind of the voting public or the public interested in politics, let's say, it's the sort of people that will go on Question Time generally being
weirdos,
low caliber, and getting the politicians they deserve. Are you, as a man of kind of conscious of the use of statistics as a tool. How do you feel about IQ as a measure? I've got some views that I can share, but I'd love your thoughts.
I've never looked into it that closely, I must admit. I'm not trying to weasel out of answering the question. I genuinely haven't looked into it very closely. I mean, I believe it correlates with all sorts of things, right? So it's all clearly measuring something of use. And I don't know whether the average IQ of the country is going up or down. It certainly feels like it's going down to me.
Yeah.
Is that the Flynn effect or is that the reverse Flynn effect?
There's a sense with IQs that it's all an IQ test tells you is how good you are at doing IQ tests.
Yeah, that's what people always say. That doesn't mean anything,
But,
does it?
well, it does in a sense.
It's like, yeah, all a driving test teaches you how the test is how good you are driving. Yeah.
But it'll give you. It's very good at predicting people at the low end of the curve. So if you are genuinely, if you're going to fail an IQ test miserably, you're probably going to fail in life quite badly.
Right.
But for the rest, it's pretty meaningless.
Okay. I've never taken the test. Have you?
No. I have, and I don't do very well.
Middling result.
Exactly. If I'd done really well, I think I'd be kind of talking about how good. This is a really good predictor.
I'm too scared to take one in case.
Yeah. No. It's just something that I never kind of these sort of shapes and all this sort of stuff intuitively get, but I kind of I just see it as another example of people trying to distill very complex things into simple averages, and then base policy around that with all sorts of
and very high IQ people can make huge mistakes.
Yeah,
thanks to hubris and having a very blinkered view of issues.
So, one more question for you before we wrap up. What is a time zone activist?
That was that's my Twitter profile. I should explain, folks. I have been running for some time a semi-tongue-in-cheek campaign against moving the clocks back in October, because I genuinely think life gets worse as soon as it happens, and it gets better when the clocks go forward in spring. And at the very least, they should be going forward in February, not March. It makes no sense for them to change 8 weeks before the shortest day and then change 13 weeks after. I think anyone could see that is insane. I accept that this time of year, we're speaking in December, it doesn't make a lot of difference having an extra hour in the evening. Fully accept that. Fully accept also that getting up, or leaving the house at 9 o'clock and it's still dark is pretty grim too. And I fully accept that none of it works very well for people in Scotland. However, I will make the case that we're better off getting rid of GMT, to sticking to British summertime all year round for various different reasons. And I got invited onto a BBC politics show, or BBC Politics Southeast, to discuss this. And I think I was sort of the light relief in the middle of the show, and they weren't taking my campaign terribly seriously. In fact, it's not actually a campaign. I think they thought I was literally running a campaign, and because I use the hashtag not on my watch. And hashtag daylight robbery, they thought I was actually running a campaign, and I was introduced as the Sussex man because there was a local element to this. You see. I was the Sussex man who was refusing to change his clocks tomorrow, as it was, right? And I had to point out I wasn't actually going to do that, and that would make me a bit of a crackpot. I was keen to make clear I wasn't just some local crank.
You weren't living an hour ahead of everyone else. So
yeah.
You're late. No, you're late.
Well, at the end of it, she signed off, the presenter signed off by saying, we'll be back next Sunday at 10 o'clock or 11 o'clock if you're Chris Snowdon, which I thought was quite a nice touch. That was good. So, yeah, but the strapline when I appeared on the screen was Christopher Snowdon, time zone activist, which is superb. So I've used that as my description. It used to be, a year or two ago, what was it? It was former epidemiologist, now military strategist and energy analyst. And this was a sort of a satirical attack on people on Twitter who think they're always experts about whatever come up. So we come out of COVID, hence epidemiologist, and we had the Ukraine war, hence military strategist and energy analyst. And I thought this was fairly obviously a joke, because that would be a very unusual career progression. Why would you give up epidemiology at all, let alone get into military strategy? But I was then quoted in the Daily Mail. This actually brings both threads together. because I put a tweet out saying, before the mini budget, the notorious mini budget, saying that I'd been hearing rumours in Westminster. Most of my fake tweets start with me saying I'm hearing rumours. Hearing rumours in Westminster that Kwasi Kwarteng is going to scrap Greenwich Mean Time. I'm going to stick on British summertime all year round. And the Daily Mail immediately reported this as a news story. And not only that there was a rumour about this, but that this rumour had been reported on Twitter by Christopher Snowdon, former epidemiologist and now military strategist and energy analyst. It then got picked up by the Sunday Times and the Scottish Sunday Times and one or two other newspapers. So journalists really are supposed to rely on at least two sources, aren't they? Not just take anything on Twitter from somebody who's clearly got a parody profile, but making the news.
Yeah, there's another example of that. There's one of the most. That is a great story, by the way. So that'll stick with you for the rest of the day. But so in the sports world of sports journalism, there's a very, very popular Arsenal blog called Arseblog, and they started in their news part of their news website would be to, in the middle of their stories, put things like, Wayne Rooney has 3 tits or something like that, because they knew that journalists were just copy pasting their news and using it on the Guardian or the Telegraph sports section. Right, yeah. So just to kind of like catch them out, because people are just so lazy. And I guess it goes back to our thing. We were talking about masks. First, it's the experts say don't use masks, and the experts say do use masks. And then what really intrigued me about kind of human behavior was that people would have Twitter emojis, like there would be a picture of a mask and a needle to signify that you've been jabbed, and an EU flag and a Ukraine flag. And is this whole thing, are we just really just haven't left the tribes, despite hundreds of years of scientific revolutions and enlightenment thinking, that we are just so tribal that this statistics is just there to enforce our tribalism rather than free us from it?
Oh, evidence is definitely used to, like a drunk uses a lamppost, more for a support than illumination, as they say. I don't live under any kind of misapprehension that anything I do makes a great deal of difference. I can go out there and show such and such a thing, cite this evidence or something, and it will be picked up by people who people who basically agree with me and want ammunition for their cause. It's very unlikely to actually change anyone's mind, I fear. Possibly younger people who haven't yet fixed on their, decided exactly what they believe. But I don't believe in evidence-based policy. I'm actually much more cynical about this than I've ever been, and I started out fairly cynical about it. I don't think there's such a thing as evidence-based policy, really. I think that it's all money and power and vanity, pretty much. Evidence doesn't really change anything. I've been doing what I do for long enough to see campaigns go from sort of an idea to policy to you can actually see what happened in the real world, and they just don't work, but nobody ever turns around and admits it. Minimum pricing for alcohol clearly didn't work. They had a sunset clause. It was supposed to go if it didn't work. Alcohol-related deaths in Scotland are now 10% higher than they were before minimum pricing, but they just put out a modelling study saying actually they've fallen by 13%. And you had someone on the BBC in Scotland standing in front of this graph showing alcohol-related deaths going up year on year and looking at down the camera and saying alcohol-related deaths have fallen by 13%. And it's like, this is just Orwellian. Double speak. Literally, I can see the deaths going up and you're telling me they've fallen by 13%. Well, according to a model. Sugar tax didn't work. Again, they came up with a model saying it kind of did, sort of, for one subgroup of girls. They can get away with anything, really. I mean, they're kind of untouchable, these people. And it's not just public health, I suspect. Public health is just the area I know a bit about. Policy is not based on evidence. It's based
foreign policy,
on
military policy, as you've alluded to. But so, and you've alluded to this earlier in terms of, the 5-year election cycle. There's the feedback loop is too extended for people to feel there's no skin in the game. People don't feel the consequences of their bad decisions, no matter the impact that they have. And the issues I write about, to be honest, even though they're in the news a lot, they're really quite low salience issues for a lot of people. They just don't care. And if Iron Brew gets reformulated with less sugar and it tastes horrible, that's kind of annoying to people who like Iron Brew.
but it doesn't make a lot of difference to anybody else. Smoking, we haven't really talked about this ludicrous prohibition idea of Rishi Sunak's, which originally came from Jacinda Ardern's. This is a classic example, I think, of.
So what's the policy?
No one born before 2000. No one born after 2008 will ever be able to buy tobacco products. All tobacco products, including heated tobacco and pipe tobacco and snuff, because know how many kids love snuff. There's a huge snuff epidemic in this country, and Rizla. Won't be able to buy cigarette papers, which is hilarious that the government's going to progressively ban pieces of paper from being sold. And he announces at the Tory conference in a speech that was all about how he is thinking about the long-term interests of the country, if you remember, right? It was like the last 30 years, all my predecessors have been short-termists, but I'm thinking about the long-term future of the country, so I'm going to scrap most of HS2 and I'm going to ban people from smoking gradually.
And buying paper.
But only from 2027, right? The first 18-year-olds will turn, the first people affected by it will turn 18 in 2027, so he almost certainly won't be in office. Even if he was, this thing isn't going to really have a major negative effects in terms of the very predictable effects of prohibition. Not going to have any effect for several years, let's put it that way. So it's the most short-term thing you could do in a way, because he's just announcing this thing. He's not going to be around to see the repercussions of it. He's just getting some good headlines. Didn't get a bump in the polls, by the way. Apparently it polled really well as an individual policy. It made no difference to the overall polls. Sunak's now the least popular person in his own government, according to the views of Tory members, which again is a low salience issue. People might go, "Yeah, I don't like smoking." All people hear, I think, when the government says we're going to stop people who are 14 years old from ever smoking, they just hear the word 14-year-olds. They go, "Well, yeah, I don't think 14-year-olds should smoke." Yeah, they don't really take the fairly short leap of imagination to go, well, they're going to be 24 in 10 years' time, and then they're going to be 34 in 20 years' time, and maybe actually they should have the right to buy cigarette papers.
Yeah.
So to me, it was just classic, political pygmy, these little men. I don't mean, I'm not going to go his height, but I mean, intellectually a little man coming up with this pathetic, ludicrous idea, really. It seems every time politicians want to create some kind of legacy for themselves, they're saying, let's give smokers another kicking. We haven't given smokers a kicking for a while. Blair introduced a smoking ban, left office 4 days before it began. I never thought that was a coincidence. I thought he thought there was a good chance that a lot of people in pubs are just going to go, we're going to carry on smoking. Never happened because of the way they enforced it. But that was his legacy, really. I don't want my legacy to be Iraq War. I want my legacy to be this big thing that people notice, which a lot of people can be in favour of. Theresa May, she introduced this 2030 target for Britain going smoke-free. Never asked smokers about it, but decided by 2030 we're going to be smoke-free. So it just seems, again, it really comes back to this, my point, which is that we have very, very one-dimensional, shallow politicians. And the things that these people are interested in, like let's stop people smoking, let's stop people driving petrol cars. These are the things that really seem to interest them for some reason. And the things that really matter, like building houses and keeping the lights on, they don't.
Yeah, I suspect it's a function of, we're in an position of affluence.
Well, we think we are, but I mean, are we? I mean, we're living off. We're living off the past.
These are kind of luxury beliefs, aren't they? For people who've got time. Yeah. That's all right. Take it if you need to.
No. The luxury beliefs, exactly, for people in a privileged position. And so the things they think about is like, there's too many fat people. We need to sort it. And the thing is that they'll pick things that they can't really even tackle properly anyway. The government can't stop people getting fat. There's nothing the government can do other than bringing back rationing, perhaps, that's going to stop people being fat. There's nothing they can do about the climate. There's nothing a British politician, no matter what they do, they're not going to have any effect on the climate. But they have these, despite being really very often quite inadequate people, they have these incredibly messianic agendas. Like it's a worst of both worlds. Well, you've got people who can't deal with actually fairly straightforward problems, trying to deal with incredibly complex and almost impossible problems.
Well, if someone needs to tell Rish, if you want to win the next election, make it easier for young people to buy a house, make the hospitals work.
Yeah, but he can't. I mean, even if he agreed with that, he can't do anything in the time frame he's got.
No.
So why is he going to bother?
Yeah. Well, let's actually, before I ask my final question, I'll ask the final question because it might enable you to bring a bit of positivity into this discussion. No chance. Okay, well, let's see. But I'd like to, as you know, I like to end these conversations with something I call the long bet, where you have a 10-year time frame. And now why 10 years, not 9 or 11 or 5? I think because it's sufficiently far away enough to be meaningful, but it's not so far away that you couldn't be called up. If we do this podcast again in 3 or 4 years' time, I can go, Chris, how's that bet coming along? But there's something that and I know, having trashed forecasters and predictors, myself, most of my last 2 or 3 years of my adult life, I just do this as a bit of fun because it enables people to kind of scratch that forecasting itch without too many consequences, but something that you think will happen over the next 10 years, or something that you would like to happen in the next 10 years. And if it's the latter, answers such as world peace are to be discouraged.
Yeah, well, I mean, you can't hold me up on it in 10 years' time. It's just something I'd like to happen. So I'll say something I think will happen. It goes back to what I was just talking about. I think that cigarettes, certainly, and probably all tobacco products, will be completely illegal in this country in 10 years' time. I think that assuming the government goes through with this generational ban, it will very quickly be seen to be absurd. I mean, I don't mean in 20 years' time. I mean straight away.
11.
Like when you've got second-year students can buy cigarettes, but first-year students can't. It's going to be ridiculous. And the first people to point out how ridiculous this is will be the people who proposed it in the first place, which is to say the anti-smoking groups. And they will say, what we need here, because it's daft, isn't it? You got people, they're all adults. Some of them can't smoke, some of them can. Let's have a level playing field. Let's just stop everybody smoking. And what the government will do is it will maybe dish out free vapes, although it's quite possible that vaping will be pulled into this prohibition by then anyway. But it will certainly say, right, January the 1st, 2032, whatever it is, that's it for smoking.
Yeah.
So you've got a year to give up. Here, here's what we recommend. We're going to put money into smoking cessation services, which don't work.
Can I ask you about January the 2nd then? Because, people will watch. Apparently, smoking in Hollywood's on the rise now. But people will go off to Calais and notice the French kids having a puff and go, "What is this?"
I'm not saying it's going to work.
Yeah, but the levels of smoking will, may go up as a result.
Yeah, it may well go up. I mean, it would be a disaster. We actually might get to a kind of disastrous stage even before then, actually, just from the sheer price of tobacco.
Yeah.
Price of tobacco has rocketed recently. Rolling tobacco, which is the most smuggled type of tobacco by far, even by the government's own statistics, 40% of rolling tobacco is smuggled in. And I think those statistics are almost certainly a bit optimistic. The tax on rolling tobacco went up by inflation plus 6% in March. Inflation about 10% then, so quite a hike. And then it's just gone up in the last few weeks by inflation, which is 8% plus 12%. So in the space of a year, the tax on rolling tobacco has gone up by 30-40%, nearly 40%, I think. And it's going to keep on going up and up and up because the government just can't seem to stop itself. So you'll end up with, in a fairly short space of time, a really big black market. And we've already got one, but we don't know how big it is. We'll end up with most tobacco being sold on the black market. In Australia right now, where they have the highest cigarette taxes in the world, they have got what the media routinely just casually describes as tobacco turf wars. There's the gangsters are using what they call earn or burn system, in which if you don't stock their black market cigarettes, they burn your shop down. Been more than 30 firebombings in the last few months down there. There's murders, the endemic smuggling, endemic tobacco farming, illegal tobacco farming. Big country, Australia. You can get away with growing a lot of tobacco without anybody noticing. And that's without prohibition. That's just high taxes. So this is coming down the road. I absolutely believe we'll have full prohibition, and we'll have to live through it 100 years after the Americans did with booze before maybe people come to their senses.
Well, here's a counter prediction. 2033, the state and its various apparatus will go, look, it's just not our job to tell people how to live their lives. The responsibility of people's actions lie with them.
Yeah.
They should be allowed to make the mistakes and learn from their mistakes, but it's not our
Is this going to be under Prime Minister Farage?
Well, I don't know. I mean, how does that, is it possible for that counter prediction to come? You know, what bugs me is let people make mistakes. It's not your job to stop people, as long as they're not impacting other people. You know, if you're considerate, you know, if you get boozed up and you beat people up, then you should, you know, go to lock up, you know, or if society will tell you very quickly to stop blowing smoke into people's faces. They don't like it, whatever it might be. But, you know, let people, you know, let your God and your parents and your school teacher decide how, you know, how you, or help you manage your risks and help you stop you making certain mistakes. How do we get there rather than the government doing that instead? Is it possible?
It's possible. I mean, things will swing back eventually, right? Even the Soviet Union fell eventually. And this is a less you know, repressive regime than that. So I think eventually.
But it's just funny. The first thing that ISIS did when they would sweep into a territory would be burn all the flags.
Yeah.
They'd gather all the cigarettes. It's like before the books, they'd burn the cigarettes. There's something about that symbolically that stuck with me. That why is this kind of fanatic death cult?
Yeah, and when ISIS were driven out, then the first thing people would do would light a cigarette.
Interesting.
Torches of freedom. So yeah, that is Rishi's immediate predecessor in the world of tobacco prohibition, the Islamic State.
Yeah. Well, on that note, I just would love to say thank you very much. People can find you at CJ Snowdon.
CJ Snowdon
on Twitter. Anywhere else? Facebook, really. Instagram.
No, I am on Instagram, but I treat it with the contempt it deserves.
Fair enough. So let's stick to X, the platform FKA.
No, just keep calling it Twitter.
Keep calling it Twitter.
I still call Snickers marathons, so I can easily keep calling Twitter.
Right. Well, we can find Chris on Marathon at CJ Snowdon. Thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure. Appreciate the time, and let's do it again soon.
That's it.
Cheers.